Welcome back to another episode of In-Depth Angling. Today we're going to be taking a look at and breaking down the winter bass patterns on Stockton Lake from water temperatures, locations fish go to, patterns these fish use, and what baits catch bass this time of year the best. Be sure to stay with us until the end of the video because I'm going to go over areas that you guys can go out and catch a big one yourself during the winter out on Stockton Lake. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing to In-Depth Angling so you don't miss out on the next lake breakdown and bass fishing video created to help you guys all become better anglers out on the water, catch more and bigger fish. Let's dive right into this thing here and break this lake down. In the early winter, bass are moving from their fall feeding locations up shallow to the deep water access areas on Stockton in search of stable warmer water and bait fish. Water temperature is the key factor in when that will happen. There's not really a set calendar date when that really occurs. You'll really start to see a big shift in locations from where those fish are sitting at once the water temperatures drop below 50 degrees, and not all the bass really move at once. An example of a fall feeding location here on Stockton Lake would be like the back of this cove here. That's fairly shallow. They're going to start off in the fall, and then there'll be a lot of bait fish up in here as long as the water's up that high. I know the lake has been down significantly, more so than usual this last year, so the back of this cove here right now doesn't have a whole lot of water in it. During normal pool times though, these are great fall locations, and eventually those fish are going to start to move their way back out along the shoreline here and following the steeper bank lines over here and out to this main lake point again. Is where they're going to end up wintering at, and these points that have a lot of deeper water near them and any kind of sharper change in depth, you don't want really long gradual sloping banks so much in the winter. You want quick change that fish don't have to go very far to get from deep water to shallow water to feed nearby, as the steeper banks give the fish an easier path to go up shallow for short periods of time to feed, like this one here, and slide back deeper to suspend or lay near the bottom of the lake while they are in a more negative feeding mood. During this time of year, through the transition into winter, the bass follow the same routes they do during the spring, only now they are moving out of the shallow areas instead of going up there to the shallow areas as a spawning location. So what this means is that if you can catch bass in the early spring / late winter during pre-spawn in an area, you will more than likely be able to go back there during the early winter transition heading into those colder temperatures and catch bass there on the same baits even as you do during the early spring. Some examples of these locations include main lake points like the one pictured here, bluff ends, banks that have at least a 45-degree angle slope, which this area here is a steeper slope, and you want that to run into water that is fairly deep on the other side. So you don't want to just be like 45-degree bank then it only goes down into a couple foot of water. You want that thing to run down into 8, 9, 10 foot of water at least, and have a little bit of some stability there for those fish to kind of move up and down that bank and feed on the crawdads and the bait fish that are living inside of those bigger rocks. Drop-off areas and secondary points also hold a lot of fish, so you could find some of these coves, like I'll find this one over here on the other side that has got a good example of this. It's further down here actually, right here. This area here is a secondary point. It's off the main lake, and it's got a little bit of a drop right out here where it drops off from 8 foot all the way down into the 30s. So this is at normal pool, of course, where this is registering it itself at, but there's a couple different creek beds in here, and it's kind of an intersecting spot. So these fish that are moving out from this fall feeding location and this main fall feeding location back here in the back are both going to intersect kind of right out here where this point's at, as well as these other little offshore points. So they're going to have a lot of area to kind of move in and out and be close to that deeper water where this creek channel is. The real key here though with any of these points is to have deep water access nearby and for them to be at an intersecting spot where those fish are moving in and out of an area. Another example of a little area that I have caught fish at this time of year is these bluff ends. So it's very steep there. You can see those lines right there almost black. That's almost a straight cliff drop off right there. And that's got very quick access down to deep water. The old river channel actually swings right up here against that. It really gets deep there. It's over 60 foot whenever the lake's at normal pool. But there's a ledge there, and that ledge is fairly shallow, very rocky, has got a lot of bigger cracks in it. Lots of crawfish live in that area. And during those times when the wind's blowing in here, hitting this, it really helps those fish move up and get feeding, especially if a cloudy, windy day comes by and it's a little bit warmer out. You can expect to catch some of those fish up shallow, and then they'll end up going back down and dropping off whenever it gets to become night or when there's a cold front come through. It's also very good when you find those areas that have that darker rock, like this area here does off this bluff, where those fish will come up and they'll sit super shallow relatively to where they've been at and just kind of sunning themselves on top of those rocks. Try to cast around with some jerk baits, but these are the kind of areas I look for. Steeper banks, bluff ends, points, areas where channels are connecting and where those fish are going to be kind of using them as a highway, and where those intersections are. Those are going to be great areas where those fish are going to be having to move through, and if you get the right conditions, those are going to be your ideal times to be fishing up a little more shallow and catching these fish. But as we move further into winter, open water areas with standing timber or brush piles play a bigger role in where bass will start to hang up at, oftentimes suspending around woody structure. So as you guys move out here, and you can do some offshore fishing as well, away from these steeper bank areas and points which I just talked about, you might be able to find some standing timber or some brush piles even out here in the middle of the lake, different drop-offs on these main lake areas where people have sunk some brush. Those are great locations. There's a lot of area out here that is still very deep, has a lot of transition to it, kind of a big feeding flat. Once the bait gets up there and you can find bait fish there, you're bound to find just about a mix of everything on this flat. So that's a good area to go out to and check out offshore. Anywhere you're seeing a lot more of this blue, like in these areas here, and even as I go up the lake here, I'll show you guys another area that's got a lot of standing timber in some of these coves that are kind of off the bank. Even though they're bigger creek coves, they're just tons of flooded timber in fairly deep water. As you get down here, this cove is ranging around between 40, 50 foot deep out here, and there's a ton of offshore structures. There's submerged bridge, old road beds, there's standing timber all throughout this whole thing, and some of those trees stick up out of like 50 feet of water. Live imaging sonar is a huge plus to help you try to find some of those fish. It can be done without it, but your odds of locating those fish is a lot less likely, especially if you're having to fish standing trees or something that is not as isolated. If you're going to try to do this with just regular sonar, I would recommend trying to find just some brush piles. I'll leave a link in the description below to the brush pile map that Missouri Department of Conservation has, and it'll tell you like the size, structure, and everything of where those are, GPS coordinates, all that kind of stuff. If you have live imaging though, like I said, I like to go play around on the trees and catch the fish that way. Right outside this area though, from that standing timber, is steeper banks in this cove as well, and some other main lake and secondary points. As you guys can see, there's some creek beds sitting over here, point over here kind of moves over, there's more road bed, there's submerged bridges, and then you have steep rocky bluff end like points. It's got a lot of crevices and cracks crawfish like to hide into. If I'm fishing areas that are more rocky, I like to cover some water with some wigglewort style crankbaits or throw around a crawdad style soft plastic that's on the bottom and kind of hop it along through those boulders if those fish are a little bit more inactive. Some of the best baits that I like to use out on Stockton Lake this time of year include jerk baits that really excel in the colder months in Stockton's clear water. This is my go-to anytime I'm fishing for suspended bass on wood or rock structure. You can fine-tune the cadence and pause time to adjust with the conditions. And this bait catches some of the more finicky fish that won't bite other presentation. And this bait really draws out fish from cover. So if they're really tight in a brush pile or they're hiding up underneath some of those standing trees and it's sunny out and they're kind of hanging closer towards those branches where you can't really present anything in there to them, they're suspended in the middle of the water column on that wood. This is something that can draw them out from that cover and they'll come to it. If they're really inactive, slow down your cadences. If you don't know how to use a jerk bait, twitch it with the tip of your rod tip, pulling the bait forward. You don't work this with your reel so much, but you work it with your rod, and then give it a pause from 5 to 15 seconds. And if they're pretty active, you can get away with closer to 5. If they're not hitting anything in that kind of speed, you can slow down to be 15 seconds. I don't like to fish any slower than that. I know some guys go up to almost a minute when they pause between jerkbait cadences, and that's totally up to you with what you're comfortable with doing. Wigglewort style crankbaits have been around forever and work well when fished along rocky cover and transition zones on the bottom. Work these close to the bottom and try to keep the bill of the crankbait down, ticking off the top of the rocks. On your retrieve, you'll kind of feel the bottom through your rod. You'll notice differences where it's kind of ticking the rocks a little bit. You want to fish this in areas that are vacant of a lot of woody structure, these things will get hung up really bad if you're trying to fish them around standing trees or brush piles or stumps even. So you want to try to keep them in more rock, and these bills are very, very well designed to where they'll kind of roll off, create a lot of reaction strikes. It looks like a little crawdad fleeing along the bottom there. It's not the most natural looking thing in the world, but it gets a reaction strike from those fish. You can burn this across something and be able to catch them fairly quickly relative to other baits, covering a lot more water quicker. And this is something that I like to use to search and find fish, especially if I think that they're going to be up shallow that day. They have different colors in this stuff. If you want to be fishing some more heavily stained or muddy water area where you're up the river on either arm of Stockton Lake, where you're getting a lot more into that largemouth territory, something like a fire tiger or like a muddy crawl style of bait works great. I love that they're red and stained water. I tend to get bit more on that than anything. If I'm fishing more clear though, I really like to go more of with like a brown or an orange. Texas rig crawfish baits, jigs, Ned rigs, and drop shots all work well when fish are biting a little bit deeper after cold fronts or when slowing down to fish an area more thoroughly. If I've gone through an area, fished with that wigglewort on a few different casts, and I've caught like one fish from there, but I believe that there's more there, I'll throw a chicker crawl or something and work it more slowly through those rocks, and more finesse style presentation for more of those inactive fish. And you're often going to catch a lot more if you go back through and hit those areas, because these fish don't really separate a whole lot during the winter, I find, especially if there is a front that's coming in and they're getting up ready to feed. They'll almost move up in waves. And so you can go by an area at 10 o'clock in the morning and catch one fish, and then come back around at noon and you won't be able to catch anything at all. And then at 2 o'clock you can go back to that same area and catch 8. It really depends if the fish are going to be moved up, in a lot of its timing and you being there at the right place at the right time. But those fish a lot of times will sit off deep, wait for their time to go up and feed for a short feeding window, gorge themselves on crawfish and dying shad, whatever they can find up there, and then push right back off into that deeper water. So baits like this, you can fish at different depths, really will help you with that situation, and they'll pick up a lot more of those fish in different depths and have a lot more versatility with these as well, giving those bass a little bit of more of a different presentation than what everybody else is throwing. If you're not getting bites on this, switch up to another style finesse bait. And I really like to stick with more natural colors. You can play with this a little bit, like a green pumpkin or a watermelon candy. Sometimes they want a little bit more of a translucent thing if it's in super clear water. Sometimes if it's super sunny out, I feel like the flake that's in this stuff, all the different kinds of sparkle in it, kind of catches their attention a little bit. But generally, 90% of the time, I'm going to be throwing something in a green pumpkin color, of whether it is a drop shot worm or a chicker craw, just something pretty natural in Stockton, because the water is generally fairly clear. If you're running up the river, though, sometimes it pays to have a little bit of a darker presentation and have something that's going to really just stand out and have a silhouette there. Stockton Lake has 298 miles of shoreline created by a dam on the north side of the lake and 2 major channels that flow towards the north and kind of join in up here in a V shape. Because Stockton is such a big lake with varying depths and widths of channels, the lake heats up and cools down unevenly, so the water temperature can vary quite a bit. Areas down here towards the dam are going to be the last areas where these fish are up there in the fall pattern, and up here towards the river arms, on either arm of Stockton Lake, you're going to have a faster cool down. So if you're looking to get into more of a winter bite earlier in the year, go into like late November through December, depending on the weather patterns each year, these are going to be the areas that you're going to be finding those fish pushed off more into the deeper water, up along the channel swings, over along bluff ends, such as this, and that flooded timber out here in the channels. Those are going to be great areas to go fish in December, a little bit earlier. In a general year, the bass are going to be more in the backs or in the middle of these coves towards the bottom half of the lake over here, like the one I was showing you guys, this flooded timber in here. They might not be out here sitting in that super deep timber yet. They might be closer towards the back here where these creek beds and these flowages are coming into. The shad might be a lot further up there. And really, once those bait fish move out, those bass are going to follow. The deeper water takes a lot longer to change in temperature because there's more of it. It's a lot more stable. So you guys can kind of play with what bite you want to go chase during that early transition. Now, if you guys are wanting to go and catch more fish during the winter section, during the late part of winter, this area down here by the dam is going to be your more stable water. During a lot of that, the river areas, especially as we get closer towards spring, are going to have a lot more sediment coming through because there's a lot more rain during the spring, and it's going to be dirtier, dingier, more stained water, even more so than it is in general. Those are going to be harder bites a lot of times because cold, muddy water is just hard to fish. Smallmouth bass are also more common down here towards the dam. It's a lot more open, more cleaner water in general. The largemouth and spotted bass can be found in that area as well, but are more common up in the upper 2/3 of the lake, where the water is generally more stained, murky colored. There's a lot more standing timber and shallower channels overall. Some areas that I tend to find a lot of the smallmouth bass sitting at during the wintertime are over here along the east side of channel here once the two channels merge. There's a lot of really big bouldery type of structure that's over here, some big drop-offs. This is a very shallow point that drops off fast here. All kinds of stuff usually hangs off of that. If there's some bait fish around, that makes it even better. There's some old road beds that are in here as well that kind of lead up. Sometimes you'll catch some smallmouth dragging across a little bit of a Ned rig or a shaky head along that drop shot style bait. There's also quite a few creek channels that are in here, and any of these points can hold smallmouth at any time. Really, what the fish are going to be more active in feeding if you have a nicer, warmer day, some winds blowing in here. Expect those points in this cove here on either of these points here to heat up, and you can catch some of those fish with those shallower running baits that I mentioned earlier. I would tend to find them more on colder days, here more off the drop-offs. Use your live sonar and see if you can pick some off with your jerk baits or Alabama rigs that are really good at imitating those bigger schools of shad that are just kind of out there cruising. And I like to divide up some of these other coves that are down here into like third, because once you're down here on this section of the lake, the cove is actually deep enough to hold the fish year round. I mean, especially this one here, with all the standing timber in it, there's tons of cover, plenty of depth, and lots of bait that's in here. The fish don't really need to leave for any reason. I like to divide this up and see what depth they're holding at. So if you can find some fish in the very back third of the cove here, that means that I'm going to be fishing a lot of these other pockets and kind of staying with more of that shallow bite. I would come over here the next cove up and go straight to the back third where there are a few different creek channels that move in, and I'd be keying in on this secondary point here. If you're catching some more fish in the front third of the cove here after like a cold front or something, it's more open water, a lot more steeper points, main lake style of structure. Then I'm going to come over here and fish the first third of this cove as well along this main lake point here, along the bluff end, and onto the inside of this point, kind of going down the bank, fishing these different secondary points that are in here towards the front section of this massive cove. Another area that I tend to catch some smallmouth out of this time of year is over here by Hawker Point. There's a ton of steeper rock that's in here that the fish really love, especially in the front third of this cove off either of these points here. Steep, deep water access nearby. Lots of crawfish up in those rocks, and the smallmouth love it. There's some deeper secondary point accesses here for those fish to sit up on as well. I'll sometimes catch those fish in those areas. Further back in here, though, I tend to catch a lot more of these fish on these banks, and there's a ton of largemouth back in this cove. Tend to catch quite a few nice sized largemouth out of here every winter. I try to find the steeper banks, really key on anything that's over a 45-degree bank as I'm going back in here, fishing along those wiggle warts, fishing along with those jerk baits, and covering open water here. This year I don't think we're going to have a whole lot of water back in here because it's been just so low and dry, but as soon as you come out here and you start getting into the steeper bank, I really like to find some nice largemouth back in through there. They tend to really like to set up on that, repeat those kind of patterns, and find those same fish in other areas. If you have like a 60-degree day in January and sunny out, you might be able to go back into those areas and be able to catch some more fish that are pushing off of these creek channels in the middle of these coves and pushing up closer towards that bank to go feed. As we come up here onto the river arms, further upstream on the southern section of the lake here, there's not so many bigger coves, but the main lake actually in that channel becomes more of a cove-like structure, if that makes sense to you guys. There's a lot of main lake breaks and steeper, bluffy kind of transitions with little ledges where there's lots of rock. Those fish oftentimes use this area just like they would one of those bigger coves down there. They'll sit out here in this flooded timber and move up here onto these little flat lips. Anywhere that there's a little bit of a sharp change with a bunch of chunk rock on them, I love to use crankbaits through those areas. I love to fish the main channel out here with jerk baits, Alabama rigs, that kind of stuff, to pull those fish out of that wooden structure because there is so much flooded timber up here. Although not all these coves up here are very big, they still have a little bit of some decent depth inside of them. So there's a good little drop off right here and a point, and that kind of is a bluff end right there. Those are the kind of areas I'm going to be looking for up here on these river arms. They're not always the deepest sections of the lake, but they are fairly deep for the areas that they're in. So the fish adapt for what section of the lake that they're in. 15 foot of water might be plenty deep, and it might be the deepest section of the channel up here on these upper river arms. Lower end of the lake towards the north, 15 foot might just be the very back of one of these coves. So it's a lot different depending on what section of the lake you're fishing on. These are all great spots you guys can go out there in this winter and hopefully catch some nice big largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass on Stockton this year. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, leave a thumbs up down below and comment what you would like to see next on the channel. I really appreciate everybody watching this to the end of the video. Hopefully this helps you in some way go catch some bigger fish, and we'll catch you guys on the next one. Explore deeper. There's more out there.